following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always had some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me. Yeah.
Welcome to the Haftorah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about prophets like Jeremiah. And every so often, we find a prophet of a female persuasion. And this week, we get to talk about one of the most heroic of figures in the Tanakh, regardless of gender, Devorah.
Yeah, Deborah. She was also a poet, don't you know it?
Indeed, she was, or at least all of chapter 5 of the book of Judges, from which we read is a song attributed to Devorah, describing the great victory of the Israelite tribes over the Canaanites. By the way, Rick, do you happen to know offhand how many times the Haftorah comes from Judges?
Well, let's see. There was Louis Brandeis, Felix Frankfurter, Arthur Goldberg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, Elena Kagan.
No. Those are Supreme
7?
Court justices who happen to be Jewish.
Yeah, and they all probably had Bar mitzvahs, so there were times when the Haftorah came from Judges. Doesn't that answer your question?
I meant the book of Judges. The answer is 3.
Well, I knew that too. But I object. Let's get some order in the court, or I'll hold you in contempt. What happened to our introduction?
Okay. I'm Larry Herman, drinking some very fine Chardonnay tonight, and talking Haftarah with my very fine chaver, the king of cantillation, Rick Muller. How you doing, Rick?
Just fine. I enjoy your humor that you write out for us here. I really enjoyed chanting Haftorah, and this week we have a really long one.
Long and interesting, Rick. We read practically the entire story of Devorah, one of the first of the judges, or shoftim, of the people as they were conquering and settling in the land. Chapter 4 is the prose version of the story, and chapter 5 is the poetic version. For reasons that I don't understand, we omit the first 3 verses of chapter 4, which provides a bit of historical background and introduces us to Jabin, the king of the enemy Canaanites, and his general, Sisera. We pick up the story with verse 4, describing Devorah as a Isha Neviah, or a prophet woman, but also as a Shoftah, which we translate as judge, but is closer to the meaning of a chieftain.
Yes. And in between those two, I'm noticing now you have the word he with a tavir under it. So she, it's all about a woman and the strength of a woman. I like it. And there's another woman who also shares honors as the hero of the story later on.
True. There are numerous midrashic stories about Devorah, but none that I could find that explain how she, a woman, ascended to the position of power in tribal Israelite society of that time. There's an interesting midrash that plays off of her being the wife of Lapidot to suggest that she was in charge of the lights of the tabernacle, and she earned her position from that. But the basic story, as told in chapter 4, is a simple one. Devorah calls the military leader Barak and tells him to gather a fighting force from the tribes of Naphtali and Zvulun to attack Sisera, the commander of the Canaanite army. Barak agrees only if Devorah accompanies him, something she mockingly agrees to. A bit of early feminism in the Bible, huh?
Yeah, it's early feminism, but I don't think Deborah was mocking Barak. I think she was pointing out the obvious, that that she would help him, and the people need to see both of them. And she was also forecasting the end of the story, where Yael is the one who actually kills Sisera, so that in verse 9, God will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah predicts that. So there's that, and then we have the connection to Miriam in the Parsha, of course.
Interesting stuff.
As the first strong woman. Yes, go ahead.
Anyways, the battle is won. Sisera escapes and finds refuge in the tent of Yael, who pretends to protect him, only to kill him by driving a tent stake through his head.
Ugh, graphic stuff.
Well, the book of Judges is full of rather graphic stuff. This is pretty tame by comparison. Anyways, an interesting twist that doesn't get much attention is that Yael is not an Israelite, but rather a Kenite. And the text tells us that her husband is the descendant of the father-in-law of Moses. One wonders about this part of the story, since the battle had already been won and has nothing at all to do with Devorah.
Oh, very interesting. But when do I talk about the trope here?
Right away. But before you do, don't you want to mention that we have two traditions about what to read?
Yes, sure. The Ashkenazim read most of chapter 4 here, the prose description, and then they read chapter 5, the poetry. The Sephardim only read the second part.
The poem in chapter 5. So it's the poem or song that is the connection to the Parsha, which includes the Shirat Hayam, or the Song of the Sea. So Rick, which tradition are you going to follow?
Neither. I thought we could do some of chapter 4 and some of chapter 5.
All right, sounds good. But what about your trope drash? What do you have?
Right. Okay, so there's all sorts of trope here, especially in chapter 4. Very dramatic, very fancy, very intense. It's like a really intense orchestra with all the instruments, the percussion, the drums, everything, like the 1812 overture. It's like really intense. And the two that stand out for me, the beginning of verse 9, the beginning of verse 24. 9 is on the word vatomer. There's azla geresh there. It's a pretty rare trope. And that's she said. That's Deborah who's talking to Barak there. And in verse 24, vatelech, the translation here is, it just ignores it, the hand of the Israelites. But vatelech is, to me, is, and she went out, like Yelech is going, halach, and Yad B'nai Israel. So that's Yael, that's her hand going out and killing Sisera. So it highlights the strength of the two women, which is just a terrific thing to do that musically. Those are the only two Azla Gereshes in the piece, and it's surrounded by all this other crazy stuff going on. So you'll see as we go along, but
I do see
fancy trope all over the place.
I do see. I actually literally see it. As you know, every week I take the Haftarah and I highlight all the special trope as you've taught me. And this week's Haftarah is just filled with color on my page. Lots and lots of special trope. Like you said, the 1812 overture with the cannons at the end. Bum, 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 bum.
Yeah.
All right. Well, how about if we start off by reading from chapter 4, verses 4 to 10, which basically sets the stage. And then we can move on to verses 11 to 16, the other verses that describe the victory over the Canaanite army. And we'll conclude chapter 4 with verses 17 through 24, which describes Yael killing Sisera and the coda to the story. And then as an added treat, you're going to read for us the final 4 verses of chapter 5, 28 through 31, which presents a very interesting twist of perspective to the poem, which we'll talk about when we get there.
Yes, another woman, but not an Israelite. Great.
All right.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen. And you want to announce the page where the commentary is on page 423 of Eitz Chaim, and the Haftorah, where you're going to start chanting, is on page 424.
Udvora isha neviah eshet lapidot hi shavta et Yisrael ba'et hahi vehi yoshevet tachat omer Devorah Ben Harama Uvein Beit El Behar Ephraim Vaya'alu Eleha Bnei Yisrael Lamishpat Vatishlach Vatikra Levarak Ben Avinoam Mikedesh Naphtali Vatomer Elav Halo Tziva Adonai Elohei Yisrael Lech Umashachta Behar Tavor Velakachta Imcha Aseret Alafim Ish Mibnei Naftali Umibnei Zvulun Umashakti Elecha El Nacha Kishon Et Sisera Sartzva Yavin Vet Richbo Vet Hamono Untatihu Biyadecha Vayomer Elecha Barak Im telchi imi Behalachti Vim lo telchi imi lo elech Vatomer Haloch elech imach Efes ki lo tiyeh Tifartecha al haderech asher ata holech ki viad isha yimkor Adonai et Sisera vatakom Devorah vatelech im barak kedsha Vayazek Barak et Zvulun vet Naftali Kedsha Vaya'al Baraglav Aseret Alfei Ish Vatal Imo Dvorah.
Wonderful. You know, Rick, as you know, I'm partial to those Kadma V'Azlaz and the Azla Gerish, and those first verses are just chock full of them.
Right. What I'm noticing is Raglav here, his legs, and that also comes into play with Sisera later on. He's the description is he's at her legs, lying down asleep. So there's parallels there. I know the writer wrote it that way. I think that's what I'm seeing.
I also noticed that I think it's a yativ on the word ephes.
Yes, yeah, just kind of
9.
sitting there by itself. No, right? Nothing, no glory.
Zero. Ephes is zero. So
yeah.
no glory. You're right.
Right. But Barak doesn't care about that. He wants to get the best people on his side, and he knows. At this point, he knows Deborah's importance, so he wants her with him. So
if we move on from verses 11 to 16, we'll hear the description of the victory.
Yes.
Barak, it doesn't really mention Devorah's role, but we know that she's accompanying him.
Right. It's like Miriam with Moses. She doesn't have a big role until the end when she leads the women. And the chariots, of course, is a direct connection. Being chased by chariots in the Parshat, of course.
Can I just draw your attention, or the attention of our viewers, to in verse 10 you just read, we had a kadma v'azla on v'yazak barak, and we have the exact v'yazek, the same thing, v'yazek Sisera in verse 13. You're going to read in a minute.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a connection there between the trope.
Well, that yazek is like to call, right? To shout.
Mustard is what it says. Mustard, not the condiment, but calling up the troops. In verse 10, it's Barak, then mustard, and then in 13, so Sisera ordered. Same thing.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the parallel commanders, yeah.
There you go. All right. Start with verse
11 to 16. Okay. V'chever hakeni nifrad mikayin mibnei chovav choten Moshe vayet oholo arelon b'tza'ananim asher et kedesh vayagidu l'Sisera ki Allah Barak ben Avinoam Hartavor Vayazek Sisera Ekorich bo Shameod Rechev Barzel Bekol Ha'am Asherito Mecharoshet Hagoyim El Nachal Kishon Vatomer Devorah el Barak kum ki zeh hayom asher natan Adonai et Sisera biyadecha halo Adonai yatsa lefanecha vayered Barak mehar tavor vaseret alafim ish acharav vayahom Adonai et Sisera vekol harechev vekol hamachaneh lefi cherev lifnei Barak vayered Sisera me'al hamerkava Vayanos beraglav. There's he's running with his legs. Uvarak radaf achrei harechev ve'achrei hamachaneh ad charoshet hagoyim vayipol kol machaneh Sisera lefi cherev lo nishar ad echad.
You know, Rick, we didn't discuss this before, but in that last verse you just read, we've got a pair of Gershaim. And Gershaim, to me, are like a pair by themselves because you have the two little, look like apostrophes together.
Yeah.
And one is over Radaf. So Barak is chasing, right? Chasing after, I think.
Yes.
The chariot. And then on Vayipol. So...
And then he fell.
And they fell. I don't know what the connection is, but not often to see two Gershaim in the same sentence, is it?
Yeah. Right? It's drawing your attention to those words. That's what the author wants.
And lots of Darga Tavir combinations, at least in that reading right there.
Yes.
Like you said, a lot of fireworks.
Right. With a battle, somebody's up, somebody's down, they reverse. It's like that. If you've seen ancient battle movies, you know.
All right, now we get to the interesting story of Yael killing Sisera, starting with verse 17.
Through to 24. Okay.
Anything for us to look for in particular here?
Just more of the same, really dramatic. The Dargat Tavir is coming up. Vatetse Yael, when her hand, or she goes out, I'm saying, she goes, Vatetse, verse 18. That was a brave thing. She didn't have to go out to meet Sisera. She could have hid. She didn't have to do what she did. But it's the bravery of these women that impress me.
All right, take it away.
So verse 17. V'Sisera nas beraglav Hello, El Yael, Eshet Chevra Keni, Kishalom, Ben Yavin Melech Hatzor, Uven Beit Chevra Keni, Batetse Yael, Likrat Sisra, Batomer Elav, Surah Adoni, Surah Eli, Altira, Vayasar Eleha Ha'ohela, which is really rare to have that Zakef Katon 2 syllables away from the end. That hardly ever happens. Vatchasehu basmicha, Vayomer eleha, Ashkinina me'at mayim kitsameti, Vatiftach et nod echalav, Vatashkehu Vatchasehu, Vayomer eleha, Amod Petach haOhel, Vehaya im ish yavo ushelech, Ve'amar hayesh po ish, Ve'amart ayin, Vatikach Yael Eshet Chever et Yitad haOhel, Vatasem et hamakevet biyadah, Vatavo elav balat, Vatitka et hayated barakato, Vatitznach ba'aretz, V'hu nirdam vaya'af vayamot.
A dramatic moment.
Yeah. V'hine varak rodef et Sisera, Vatetse Yael likrato. So she goes out this time to call Barak over to show him what she did. V'tomer lo lech ve'areka et ha'ish asher ata mevakesh, vayavo elecha, v'hinei Sisera nofel met, v'hayated barakato, vayachna Elohim vayom hahu et Yavin melech Canaan lifnei bnei Yisrael, v'telech yad bnei Yisrael haloch v'kasha al Yavin melech Canaan ad asher hichritu et Yavin melech Canaan.
You know, Rick, in that last verse, it's interesting. The V'telach yad bnei Yisrael. But it was actually the hands of the women, and especially the hands of Yael.
Yes.
It did the deed.
Right.
Well, as we mentioned, the poem basically recounts the same story with a little bit of different detail, a few differences, which we're not going to go over right now. But we thought that the last verses were particularly interesting. So we're going to jump to verse 28 of chapter 5.
Yeah, but 27 again is where the ragleha are. At her feet he sank, laying outstretched at her feet. So the regel is leg, and raglaim were legs, and you can count soldiers, but I like the use of that noun over and over again in 27. But yeah, we can start in 28. So then here it jumps to another woman, to the mother of Sisera, and wondering about her son not coming back.
So we all of a sudden have a complete change of perspective. Up to now, we've been talking about the battle, and we've been talking about Yael killing Sisera. And all of a sudden, In verse 28, we have a line that says, "Through the window she looked out and moaned." And we don't even know at first what the window is, but there's no window in a tent. So it must be a castle. And who the she is, we kind of figure out afterwards. It's Sisera's mother.
Mm-hmm.
And she's waiting for Sisera, the general of the Canaanites, to come back from battle. And what's her expectation, Rick?
That he's going to be victorious and bring back loot and spoil.
Exactly. And he's going to bring back the spoil he's going to bring back for himself and his men are women. He's going to bring back women slaves,
Mm-hmm.
and for his mother and for the women of the Canaanites, he's going to bring back dyed stuff.
Cloth and embroidery. And in verse 30, we talked about it. Racham rachamatayim. One damsel, it says, or two. And it's not yaldot, it's not betulot, it's not isha, the plural of that. Ishot? No. Anashim? No. What's the plural of
Nashim.
Nashim, thank you. But it's not that. It's more graphic than that, from rechem, from womb.
Or even vulgar.
Yeah. It's and the two women, Rachamatayim. No, the two women we had were Deborah and Yael, and were victorious. So I'm sure that's the intent of the author, is to parallel the two women she's picturing as going to be concubines for her son or slaves for the household. That's not the way it turned out.
No, and you pointed out to me it's basically women all over. It's Devorah, it's Yael, it's the women who it's proposing are going to be the sex slaves to be brought back, and it's the women who are waiting for Sisera. Yeah. Very interesting. And then the description of the story basically just ends right there. We don't go back to Devorah. We don't go back to Barak. And the very last line you explained to me was like the narrator in a Greek tragedy.
Right. Yeah. Everybody's dead on stage, and then the head of the chorus comes out and sings the final line about how tragic the play was.
Thus perish all your enemies, Adonai, and be his friends like the sun coming out of its might. Yes. And the land was quiet for 40 years.
Yeah, the good old 40 years, to put a little bow on it.
Meaning a long time.
Yes.
All right, Rick, take us home.
From 28?
Sure.
Okay. Be'ad hachalon nishkefa vat yabev eim Sisera be'ad ha'eshnav madua. Why? Where is he? Boshesh richbo lavo madua echeru pa'ame markavotav chachmot saroteha ta'anena afi tashiv amareha lach halo yimtzeu yechalku shalal rachamatayim l'rosh gever shlal tzvaim l'sisra shlal tzvaim rikma tzeva rikmatayim l'tzavrei shalal.
Now the narrator.
Ken yovdu chol oivecha Adonai ve'ohavav kitzei tashemesh bigvurato vatishkot haaretz 40 shana.
Wonderful. Well, Rick, I wish you a happy Tu B'Shvat, because we're recording this on the eve of Tu B'Shvat.
Yes, you too.
And to all of our viewers, And Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you next week.
Shabbat Shalom.